Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to see you all, and nice to be back after about 4 or 5 years absence. As Dr. Nam Jong-un just said, I was called by the government, and so I had to my full-time effort to do my job in the government. But now I'm free, so I will devote more of my time to this forum and IG's activities. This morning, as Dr. Nam Jong-un just said, we have very special guest speaker with very special topic, and that is U.S. presidential election and its implication for Asia Pacific in particular. As you know, there are more than 50 countries in the world this year is scheduled to hold election for selecting their heads of nation. Certainly all of them are important, but U.S. election is the most important, not only for Americans, but the rest of the world. And so the U.S. election interests us so much. And we are very fortunate to have Charles Morrison, who is a very close observer of the U.S. politics, analyst of U.S. politics, as one of the leading political scientists in the United States, and also his great interest and involvement in Asia-Pacific affairs, and particularly U.S. and Asia-Pacific relations. He himself contributes so much in various endeavors, activities toward building Asia-Pacific community. As you know, the Charles Morrison is the president of the East-West Center, which was established, I believe, in 1960 by the U.S. Congress as education and research of the organization to strengthen the U.S. relations with peoples of and nations in Asia and Pacific. As we well know, there are so many distinguished Koreans got education or did research there at East-West Center, and including Dr. An Chung-young, and we have so many distinguished the scholars and policymakers and business leaders studied there and carried out the research there and associated with various capacities. I myself had the privilege of working very closely with East-West Center and Charles for many years, actually, as a board member. I'm still a member of board there, and I serve as member of a panel of international advisors. So I know personally how important East-West Center is for not only for the U.S. but the whole region in Asia Pacific. Well, Charles, as I said, as president there, I think he been with the East West since late 1990s, right? So it's been there almost 20 years now, and so during his tenure there, he made the East-West Center the more visible and do more the useful works in building particularly building is the Asia-Pacific community. We've been involved with APEC and the Asia-Pacific Council and in various capacities. We've been devoting this most of the time in activities toward building Asia-Pacific community. Well, with no further ado, I would like to invite Charles to talk about U.S. politics and connection and its implication for Asia-Pacific and Korea in particular. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming, and particularly to thank Mr. Nam and to thank Dr. Yosakang for introductions, which very much exaggerated my knowledge and what I've been doing. I know how people at Institute of Global Economics feel about Dr. Sakang because, as he mentioned, he's been on our board for the last 9 years, but somehow after Lee Myung-bak became elected president, he became extremely busy, and so we haven't seen him much at the East-West Center either. But he has perfected the art of involvement by distance, and so his presence has always been felt, and we're very appreciative of all the service he's given us. And so when I told him that I was coming to Korea for another meeting, immediately I got this request to please speak for this group, and I'm very glad to be here. But I have to explain that usually I'm talking about Asia and not the United States. And so this is kind of an experiment for me. And what I thought I would do would be to, many of you probably know more about U.S. politics than I do, but I thought I'd start with some background factors and some of the changes in the U.S. society, which I think are affecting our politics right now. Then I'll say something about the current election, and I have to be very careful what I say, because I can't recommend any winners or anything like that, but I just speak analytically about the election. And then at the end I'll say something about what I think the implications are for U.S.-Asia policy, and also more specifically about Korea. So let me start with some of these background factors. And I think one of the most important things to remember about U.S. politics is that Americans are essentially distrustful of power. So from their own revolution, they wanted to reduce power of government. They did everything in their constitution to ensure that there would be no concentration of power. So we have the famous separation of powers system, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judiciary branch with checks and balances on each other. They divided the Congress into two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, another way of decentralizing power. They divided the country into a federal system, so states have significant powers in certain areas, including international trade even, and then, of course, the federal government. So it's a system that, in some ways, was quite effective for the 18th century or the 19th century. In an age of globalization, it sometimes means that it's very difficult to make policy changes very quickly. Another background factor is the separation of church and state, a very important element in the U.S. Political system. The U.S. was a haven for people who were persecuted in their own countries, often because of religious reasons, but this has been an area of some tension as the religiosity of the American people is quite high by international standards, particularly those in Europe, although maybe not those in Korea. There is a strong tradition of isolationism throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century up to World War II. and then the United States was catapulted into World War II and into a position of global leadership ever since. Now, unlike Europe, European countries, it's not really used to an international system of several competing equal powers. It was either isolated in its own hemisphere or it was the global leader. And now, again, in an age of globalization and with the rise of China, the rise later of India, and the integration of Europe, we're facing a different situation in which the United States has to act in a way that is more compatible with a multipolar system. Free market orientation, another very strong feature of the American belief system. And finally, its perception of itself, not as an elite society, of not having nobles, but of being a middle-class society. So these are all part of the American belief system and characteristics that impact upon our political life. So right now there's a mood of some malaise in the United States. This is a measure that is often used of the degree of happiness or unhappiness politically in the society, whether people think that the country is going in the right direction or it's going in the wrong direction. And the red is the wrong direction, and the black is the right direction. Now, what happened here is at the end of the Bush period, the number of people who thought that the country was going in the wrong direction was very high compared to those that thought it was going in the right direction. The election helped right that. There was a very brief period here in which the people felt comfortable about the direction the country was going in. And then almost immediately throughout the Obama period, there was a significant decline in the number of people who thought the country was going in the right direction, an increase in the number who thought it was going in the wrong direction. And that peaked last July, August, September, when we had a big debate over our budget ceiling. And since then, certain features of the economy that make some recovery apparent have helped the administration and have made people feel a little bit better. But this is still a very large gap of people who are unhappy, angry, and it reflects the economic crisis that, in fact, in many ways is continuing. A lot of sources of insecurity that are behind this. Generally, on the economy, you still have stagnant income growth. You've had 3/4 of employment growth, but it's still above 8%, which is high unemployment for the United States. You have a massive loss of wealth from 6 or 5 years ago, and you still have the housing market in significant disarray without much improvement in housing prices. You have a significant threat to the American perception of itself as a middle-class society, and this is reflected in the Occupy Wall Street movement, the 1% versus the 99%. So many measures of income inequality, but basically they show that the highest degree of income inequality in several decades, and I'll go to perception of that a little later. A large immigration. All of these, in a way, reflect different facets, I think, of the globalization process. The percent of foreign-born, which is 12% for the country right now, again, is the highest since over 100 years. So it's a very large percentage. It's particularly high in the coastal states in California. 24%, almost 1/4 of the population is foreign-born, many of those in Mexico, but quite a few of them also in Korea, in China. And then of the growth in population, almost half of the growth in the population represents immigrant. So this is always considered, and traditionally considered, a strength of the United States, but it also, with each wave of immigration, there's been quite a bit of social tensions. Then you have the access to resources, a feeling that we've lost control. 60% of resources, of at least energy resources, having still to be imported from outside. You have all of these put together, kind of a threat to traditional values, to the American identity, to our ability to control our own lives. And so often I find that, not so much now, but maybe a few years back, that people thought of globalization as something the United States was forcing on the rest of the world. But from the American point of view, globalization is what is happening to us, what the rest of the world is putting onto us, and it's also a source of great stress. Now, what are the main political divides? They've definitely sharpened in the United States. We used to have the Republican Party and a Democratic Party with both moderate wings and significant overlap in views, and that's no longer the case. Most of the significant differences between the two parties reflect views about the role of government, with the Republicans generally favoring small government, less regulation, the Democratic Party favoring government action to address social needs. So all of these social problems, the healthcare system, the education system, transfer payments in general, are sources of great tension. Values also have been a matter, less so, but still a matter of great political concern. The Republican Party, again, trying to capture identity with traditional values, belief in nation, religiosity, constitutional rights, including gun rights, and the Democrats favoring values that are control of women over their rights, gay rights, and so forth. All of these are value issues that have been important in U.S. policy. The foreign policy area, however, even today is an area where there's much more consensus than in the other areas, and I'll get back to that when I discuss U.S.-Asia policy. Now, we've heard quite often in recent years about so-called red states and blue states. The red states are the states that vote Republican. The blue states are the states that vote Democratic, and this has changed over time. This is a 2008 election, so these red states are the ones that voted for McCain, and the blue states are the ones that voted for Obama. Traditionally, there was a big blue area down here. The South was almost solidly Democratic. That's changed. It's now very significantly Republican. But this is a map that is perhaps a little unusual in that Obama had quite a large victory, and so some of these states that are blue states are more commonly red states. But this, in some ways, is misleading. This is a map that shows the red and the blue by district. So you can see that it's a fuzzier picture. Deeper blue meaning more Democratic, deeper red meaning more Republican. And in many ways, it's an urban-rural split. Urban centers along here, of course, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, but the rural areas of the country tending to vote much more Republican. And there's another overlay that I tried to put on here, and this is not a very good map, but this is a picture of the unemployment as it was a year, almost 2 years ago, when it was 10%. And you can see that the higher areas of unemployment, Michigan, California, Oregon, the lower areas is all the Midwest. This also overlaps quite a bit with the red states and the blue states. The red area, this is a solid red area, low unemployment. People are unhappy about their taxes being paid to support unemployed workers in these areas. But these areas very much dependent on the government transfer payments, the social programs, and vote Democratic. Now let's turn to the kind of current election, and we see that the president is in some trouble. This is his approval ratings. The number who strongly approve, the number who strongly approve, and the number who strongly disapprove. The figures of disapproval went up very sharply. Then there was a period where Osama bin Laden killing helped him a bit, some other things, and it's been at a fairly high level ever since. The approval ratings went very low and then started to go up as the economy started to improve. But this is not a good picture for the president. In fact, if you looked a few months ago, anyone would have said, any political analyst would have said, a president with this low an approval rating in his third year of term had no chance for re-election. That you normally would have said, but he has a pretty good chance because the Republicans have not come up with very good opposition to him. Now, if the president's approval rating is low, the approval rating of Congress is even lower. This is hard to see perhaps, but the green line is disapproval, and the darker line is the approval rating of Congress. And this is over a 30-year period. So in the early 90s, you had very extreme disapproval of Congress. You had the Republican victory in 94. Then you had a period where there was more bipartisanship. Toward the end of the 90s, the budget deficit was coming down. You had the dot-com boom. And then that went bust. And ever since, and particularly after 2008, the disapproval rating of Congress has gone up. And the approval rating, it says here 17, but the latest figure is more like 11% approval for the Congress. And this does not help the Republicans, because the thing that most people disapprove of is the partisanship in Congress. In many ways, the political system rewards partisanship, but it also punishes it. And ever since this deficit figure crisis in August, there's been a tendency by Congress to be worried, members of Congress who are incumbents to be worried about the re-election, and a lot more tendency to try to work together despite some of the rhetoric that you hear. Now, we had this phenomena of the Tea Party. Incidentally, all of this is consequences of the American angst. People are unhappy. At the very beginning of the economic crisis, they were very scared. And so the Bush administration, the Obama administration, actually had very similar policies as Bush went out and Obama came in. Stimulus policies, efforts to try to restore growth in the economy. But as soon as people thought the situation was back to a little more normal, then that's when all their anger came out. And it was reflected very much in the 2010 election, and you can't remain that angry that long. But it still is reflected in this lack of unhappiness with the president, with the Congress, and also with the rise of various groups. And one group was the Tea Party. And the Tea Party is a phenomenon of the program that was a stimulus program, the TARP we call it, economic stimulus. And so people were, at the time that their own savings and wealth had declined, suddenly saw the government was spending a lot of money. They didn't know where that money was going. It often wasn't very visible in their lives. They didn't see it changing the economy very quickly. And so this group of people who were extremely angry formed something that we called the Tea Party. And the Tea Party was very popular at the time of the congressional elections almost a year and a half ago. And since then, it has been on the decline. This is partly because people have gone back to a more identification with the traditional parties, and it's partly because the Tea Party has kind of overreacted, and people say that the Tea Party is not a force of unity, but a force of division in society. And so the general public support for the Tea Party has gone down, and even in the Tea Party districts, the places where the Tea Party was very strong, the Tea Party movement has, in a sense, declined. But the general feelings that was behind the Tea Party movement about big government, government spending, that remains. And of course, this is the other aspect, the Occupy Wall Street. The Tea Party is largely a movement of the right. Occupy Wall Street is a movement of the left. It is was a shorter-term phenomenon and less politically potent, but it was driven by this rich-poor division. And so if you look at, this is people who feel that there is a conflict between rich and poor. And in 2009, half the people in the United States thought that there was a conflict. Now it's 2/3 of the people in the United States that feel there's a conflict. Of course, the black populations generally has seen this for many years in overwhelming numbers, but the significant increase in the white population that is concerned about this divide. And so even though the Occupy Wall Street movement has gone, the social inequities that gave it life remain and are very important in politics today. And you will see efforts by the president to try to use that as well as his opponents. The election, of course, occurs on November 6th, and it's not just a presidential election. It's a presidential election, it's congressional elections, it's governor elections, and many cities and municipalities also have election on that date. The attention usually is focused on the presidential election, but I want to just say a word about the congressional elections because they're very important. And you know, our Senate works on the basis of senators having 6-year terms and 1/3 of them being elected every 2 years. And so 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. And of those 33 members that are up for election, 23 of them are Democrats. Only 10 of them are Republicans. So the statistical probabilities of Democrats losing seats is higher than Republicans losing seats. So there's quite a bit of probability of a change in the composition of the Senate from a Democratic-controlled Senate, very slightly Democratic-controlled Senate, to being a Republican-controlled Senate. Now the House, you have a situation post the last election in which the Republicans have a very strong majority, but a lot of dissatisfaction with the Congress. And so the Democrats are likely to pick up seats in the House. But still, they would have to pick up a lot of seats in order to win the majority. So there is a significant chance that the Congress will be a Republican Congress, both the House and the Senate side. And this will be, if Mr. Obama is reelected, make his life much more difficult politically. If a Republican is elected, still, it doesn't matter that much because it's a presidential system rather than a parliamentary system. And so even a Republican president will have to contend with a very independent-minded Congress. Now, to turn to the presidential election, incumbent always has a lot of strengths. Obviously, name recognition, ability, in a sense, to control the media through his announcements, through his activities, which are always going to be covered significantly by the media. He can basically set the agenda through activities that he does. Obama, in contrast to the last time around, has the value of experience. This will be true over whatever Republican challenger he has. And there's really, it's going to be Mitt Romney, there's no question about that now. And he also has had a very successful record in fundraising, but in this next election, he will not have the advantage that he had in the next election. Some of his weaknesses, though, are that he has to run on a record Last time around, he was a clean slate. He could talk about overcoming the divisions of the country. He could talk about change, and everybody could believe him because there was no record there. This time he has to stand on his record, and of course the most important part will be the economy. I think the improvement in the economy in the last few months has helped him a great deal, but for him I think it's come a little too early. The most important thing is the last 3 months before the election. If the economy is moving up in the last 3 months, then people don't want to change the president because they think that he may have something to do with this, and so this will be helpful to him. But maybe it's a little too early. It will create expectations that this is a continuing rise of recovery, and it may not be. And then he's in big trouble. And the increase in the last few days, last few weeks, gas prices reflect the kind of factors in the economy that can be negative for him, even though the overall economy looks like it's improving. And another big issue will be who will vote. How do you get out the vote? Obama motivated many first-time voters last time around, particularly in the black community. Many of these voters believed that change was going to occur, that this was a new kind of president. Quite a number of those people feel disillusioned. Washington is still divided into red states, blue states, still very partisan. And although I think Mr. Obama can count some very real accomplishments, the expectations that many liberals had who voted for him have not been met. And so the question is, the second time around, is he able to bring out those people, motivate those people? And, it would be easy for him if he had a very extreme candidate. And because part of the motivation would be not just voting for him, but voting against the person who is his opponent. But if it's a moderate Republican, is it more moderate than some, it's unlikely to motivate a lot of those voters. Now, the challenger, you've been reading about all these primaries, and I don't understand the primary system in the United States. It's not it's not a system that was ever in our Constitution. It has grown up hodgepodge. The parties have their own rules. The states have their own rules. Some delegates are chosen by state conventions. Some are chosen by caucuses. Some are chosen by primary elections. In some of those primary elections, only the voters of that party can vote. Others, anybody can vote, whatever their party. And so it's a very complicated system. And last time around, you saw that the Democrats had a huge fight during the primary election. Hillary and Obama went right up into June, with Hillary contending, although it was clear that Obama had actually won by the end of February. And many people thought that would be very bad for the party, and yet Mr. Obama won the election. This time, it's all on the Republican side, and the problem for the Republicans is that they have no candidate, as they had last time, that is so motivating to the Republicans that it's a clear-cut decision. And so you see Mitt Romney leading, and this is last night's figures. He has 453 delegates. I should have put the number down to have a majority. It's 1,114, but he has still only about 40% of those. He leads Santorum, double the number of delegates, and then significantly Gingrich and Ron Paul. Now, if you look at how the delegates are selected through the rest of the year and the math, there's no way that Romney can lose. But he's not winning in a style that motivates his party very much. And so here's somebody who is organized, has lots of money. He has been able to deal with each contender as they come up, but he's not been able in virtually any state to get more than 40% even of the Republican primary voter. Still, of all the Republican candidates, he will be the strongest against Mr. Obama because he can move beyond the base of the Republicans, particularly appeal to independents, others who don't necessarily automatically vote for Obama. And the election, and this is very important to remember in the American election, is not about who wins the most number of votes. It's about who wins the most number of state electoral votes. And so it's really 50 separate elections. And each state has a weight that depends on the number of senators and representatives it has. And so the blue states, and this is, they're blue here. They don't look like very much of the country, but they're the heavily populated states. New York, California, Illinois, Ohio, well, that went blue last time, but not necessarily blue this time. But anyway, it's a fairly populous area. The red states look like it's a huge area, but aside from Texas, these are the least populated states. And these brown states are the so-called swing states, the battleground states, and virtually all the election focus will be on these 10 or 11 states. And these states were all won by Obama last time. And so he will be fighting to hang on to these states. And so you almost have to look state by state at what his prospects will be in each state. And some of them, like Ohio and Pennsylvania, he will have very difficult time. But his people have been working very hard on different electoral maps and where he should focus his time, as Mr. Romney's people will be too, once they get beyond the primary election. Now, there are several, I said the states are battleground states, and there's also different groups that are battleground groups. And this is just kind of looking at the ethnic side. This is the 2008 results as we think we know them from exit polls. This is a preference as of last October. And you see, of all voters, majority for Obama, about equal if Obama and Romney were running against each other at that time. But Obama's weak with white voters, extremely strong with black voters. 95% of black voters, and that constituency has stayed with him. And the Democrats have been strong with the Hispanic voters, but the preference of Hispanic voters has, for the Democratic side has decreased a little bit, as is the preference for white voters. So this is part of the calculus that Obama will be looking at and what he can do with each of these groups. The youth vote is an area where he was strong. This is the percentage of, these are the 18 to 29-year-olds, and 2/3 of them voted for Obama in 2008. Only 1/3 for McCain. Of course, McCain was the oldest candidate ever, and Obama was one of the younger ones, and so that perhaps helped skew the youth vote. But the youth also, there's been some decline in youth preferences actually on both sides, and those will firm up as the election approaches. But this will be a critical area for Mr. Obama to continue to try to appeal to. Women voters. Women voters are a majority of voters now, and they've also been a strong element of support for the Democratic Party. This is a percentage that vote Democratic. Unmarried women, 70%. White women who are unmarried, 60%. White people generally have been less supportive of Democratic parties. And these figures are 2008, and these are the figures for 2010. And you can see these preferences declined. And this was for the congressional election. So it will be better than this, but this is an area that there was, in fact, an article in the Sunday New York Times on how Obama is fashioning his strategy toward women voters, and he's taking advantage of some values issues that the Republican Party pushed in recent weeks. The white working class, an area of weakness for the Democratic Party. Midterm elections, only 1/3 voted Democratic, 2/3 almost voted Republican. So this is an area also that the Republicans will be trying to continue to appeal to, and the Democrats will be working to erode. Now, I can't make a prediction on the election at this point. If I had been asked in August or September, I thought Mr. Obama had rather low prospects of re-election. I think he's had big support, and the big support has come from the Republican Party. They simply have not found a candidate that has been appealing to them, and they've gone through a very bruising primary process. But it's much too early to say, and I think it could be a very close election. And I think of all the candidates, Mitt Romney is the one that Mr. Obama is probably most scared of. And it's because he is less ideological. But he is someone who's seen as, even among Republicans, as flip-flopping a lot. So he's been defined by his opponents in the Republican primaries in a way that's going to hurt him in the general election. But it does come down to, I think, two things. The economic factors in the last 3 months before the election, and the ability of the two parties to get out their voters and to motivate the voters. And at this point, both parties will have some difficulty in motivating the voters that came out in the 2008 election. Now, does this have much implication for Asia policy? Well, as I said at the beginning, the foreign policy has generally been an area that's been fairly nonpartisan. That's not been true in certain areas, but certainly in Asia, there was an amazingly strong transition from the Bush team to the Obama team. The Obama team wanted to emphasize reaching out to countries that the Bush people had not reached out to, like Iran and North Korea and so forth. In fact, that has not occurred. The main values, which include the alliance system, very strongly supported by both parties, the free market, very strongly supported by both parties, and a trade policy which the Obama administration was initially very reluctant to get deeply involved in. Now, of course, they pushed through the KORUS, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, which was a Bush administration initiative, and negotiating very seriously on the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, also a Bush administration initiative. But the Obama administration has had it's been a largely domestic-oriented administration. The foreign policy people have had, Hillary Clinton aside, have had a less significant role in this administration. The chiefs of staff, certainly Raul Emanuel, had virtually no interest in the foreign policy side, much more interest in the domestic side. And my own feeling, I've only met the president 2 or 3 times, but my own feeling is that his comfort is really in the domestic social issues which he worked on so long himself. Now, at the beginning of the administration, I think they did have a kind of philosophy for how they were going to move in Asia. Part of that philosophy was that Mr. Obama himself was the first Pacific president, they said. He was born in Hawaii. He lived an early life in Indonesia. He didn't have that much to do with the Pacific after that, but that gave him some credentials that virtually no other president has had. I can't think of any president who speaks Indonesian before Mr. Obama. But having tried to speak to him in Indonesian, I found that it wasn't too much either. Then they really had a strong focus on China. And they felt that the U.S. and China had common interests. These interests were in areas that were underestimated, underappreciated by the Bush people. So climate change, the kind of G2 idea, these were things that they thought they could appeal to the Chinese on, and there would be a partnership between the U.S. and China on some of these global issues. And Mr. Obama got to China the first time, in the first year after the APEC meeting, and he found that it was a different kind of environment than he thought. There's a lot of difference between the Chinese and the Americans on climate change. for example. And so the cooperation with China is going to be very, very difficult. Also, Japan turned out to be much more difficult than expected. This reflected the instability of Japanese politics, the election that brought the Democratic Party of Japan into power, that party's position on Okinawa that undid an agreement that that the Obama administration had wanted to continue with, inherited actually from the Clinton administration and then pursued during the Bush administration. And so with China and Japan being disappointed, Korea looked like a very bright spot in Asia. And by everybody's accounts, he hit it off well with President Lee Myung-bak. The U.S. always has a little hesitancy about negotiating with the North Koreans because the North Koreans are such difficult people to negotiate with. There's almost no positive political outcome from it. And so they were very happy, I think, with a policy of pursuing a very close relationship with Lee Myung-bak, not having a distance between U.S. and South Korean policy on the North Korean issue, and that allowing them to put off any real discussions with the North Koreans. And then there was a lot of emphasis on Southeast Asia, and most of this emphasis was picking up on initiatives that the Bush administration had already started. And this included ambassador to ASEAN. It included more emphasis on ASEAN and regional cooperation as a U.S. policy area. And so Southeast Asia, and particularly with Obama's background in Indonesia, looked like a very positive area for the United States. And on trade policy, because of his electoral emphasis on kind of protectionism, they just ignored trade for the first year. But then they discovered that in Asia policy, you can't have an Asia policy without a trade policy. And so they discovered from the Bush administration, again, the TPP, and picked that up actually in the Singapore APEC meeting, promised to move that forward, and now it's one of their favorite initiatives. And so regional cooperation has actually been an area of considerable interest for the Obama administration. I think it will for any U.S. administration, whether it's Romney or Obama who win the election, and partly because the hub and spoke system in a multipolar world is less and less effective. And so the United States has to work through regional organizations. It can in some ways be an arena for competition with the Chinese, but it also is an arena in which the United States can take its own initiatives, and the TPP is one example of that. The administration was very happy to be involved in the East Asia Summit. I personally didn't think that was a good idea, but they did. And I think you'll continue to see a lot of emphasis on regional cooperation. In Korea, case of Korea, I think, as I mentioned, that the desire under Obama was to continue to have a close relationship with the Korean conservative government. It was very interesting to me that a center-left government worked so closely with a center-right government in Korea, and the chorus, of course, was dusted off, passed. The question now is what happens if the political situation in Korea changes and you have a United Democratic Party government in Korea, and I don't think that in fact will make too much difference either. The interests are less party and they're more national, but the Americans will be more reluctant toward engagement with North Korea than I think a Korean Liberal Party would be. But 2013, if Obama is reelected, will be a second term. He'll feel less constrained in his second term, and perhaps if you have center-left governments in both societies, you'll see something that is quite new in terms of outreach toward North Korea. And finally, these are some very important issues in U.S. foreign policy. The biggest issue, I think, and certainly for me at the East West Center, is just the resources that are going into foreign and defense policy, and these resources are declining. And the question is how to do as much or even do more with less resources. And it has often resulted in U.S. directions that are still proposing many initiatives, but asking other people to resource those initiatives. There's always an issue of presidential time. That will come up this year with the East Asia Summit and the APEC meeting. The Democratic National Convention is just before the Vladivostok APEC Summit. President Obama has made no decision to go to that summit. Even Vice President Biden is somewhat questionable. It's been many, many years now since a president has missed the APEC summit, but I think that is something that is questionable this year. And the East Asia Summit is also questionable. Partisanship on particularly the Middle East issues, you've seen this in recent days on the Iran question, Israel question, it's definitely there. The United States, as I mentioned earlier, is in fact having to change its foreign policy style. Both the transformational diplomacy of Condoleezza Rice, as well as the smart power and three Ds or 4 Ds of Hillary Clinton, have emphasized partnership and working with other countries and less lecturing. The question of how to deal with China, probably the biggest issue in U.S. foreign policy and in terms, and really the biggest issue in terms of global governance. How these two great powers get along as China's rise continues. There's actually not that many differences. Taiwan, of course, is a special problem, but there is a significant distrust of each country in the other. China fearing that the United States is actually opposing its rise and wants to contain it. The United States fearing that China wants to undercut the system that the United States and the European countries helped create and with allies in this region in much of the last 50 years. And so that's a big question. And finally, there's these issues of what are the values for the international system. There are going to be less and less American values and more and more there have to be values that are shared. There's questions of sanctions, case of North Korea or Iran or other countries that don't share these values. So basically that's the talk. Maybe it went on a little longer than I thought it would, but I hope it's useful.
Well, thank you very much for very, very interesting and illuminating presentation on U.S. politics in general and the forthcoming presidential election and its implication for U.S.-Asia policy. Very, very comprehensive rundown on all the issues, and it was very, very educational for Korean general the public to understand the U.S. political system, in particular election system. As Charles said, U.S. The primary system is really hard to comprehend, and really it's a so complicated system. But in any case, it's a very, very good presentation. Now with this, I'm sure there are many questions and comments. Before I ask comments from and questions from the floor, let me just for the to provide a perspective, let me ask you this question. You know, the very specific question. I just would like to know how you and Americans in general react to the our opposition party's pledge to repeal or renegotiate for the one-state approach. How Americans see the see this? What kind of perception you have? I'm very interested, and I'm sure the Koreans should know, right?
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question. And first of all, the question is how many Americans know about the chorus to begin with? Not very many. But if they heard about it and they heard it was a free trade agreement, half of them would say it should be renegotiated or eliminated. And so you have to realize that there's a strong protectionist element still in the U.S. Policy that might think that chorus provided more benefits for Korea than it did for the United States. So we would still have that. But I think in general, the people in our government, the people who follow this, they're not too worried about the opposition party repealing the chorus. The chorus has gone through 2 changes in the American political system so far and 1 change in the Korean political system. I think it was started actually by under what's now the opposition group in Korea. And then it was strongly supported by the current president, and now it's kind of interesting to see the group that originally started it saying it should be repealed. In the United States case, it started with I guess with the Bush administration, and the Obama administration was initially not positive about any of the free trade agreements, but they've been supportive. And so I think it's there's what are the reasons that we would support it? In the American case, trade is an important reason and competitiveness, but I think more it's related to the U.S. feeling about its relationship with Korea, how important it is to have strategic elements of that relationship that are not simply a traditional alliance, but in the economic area. And so that's what really won an overwhelming support in the Congress, much more than a trade agreement that simply a trade agreement would ordinarily have. And it's very hard for me to imagine that a Korean government, once an agreement has been signed, come into force, would the costs of a repeal would be so damaging in terms of U.S.-Korean relationship. That would be politically, I think, quite costly for the opposition party. So I sort of see it as something that, yes, people talk about in an election, they're appealing to a particular constituency, but when you're actually in the government, if you're in the government, it becomes much harder to do these things, and so we shouldn't worry about it too much.
I'm so glad to hear that. Well, yes, it is concerning, but I'm really in agreement with you, and particularly if by the time we have a new government early next year, enough of the positive outcomes come out of chorus FTA. I think this even politics get quiet on the chorus FTA, just like the Mexican opposition, some opposition to NAFTA.
Yeah.
Became quiet after NAFTA started to produce positive outcomes. Well, now, are there any questions or comments? Yes.
I'd like to ask you why America decided to come back to Asia, and if the United States comes back to Asia, will U.S. How will the United States deal with China as a partner? China as your rising power, and I think the United States will feel it hard to deal with China.
Dr. Charles Morrison, thank you for your timely, useful, and excellent presentation. My name is Lee Sang-sol, and is my Korean family name. Allow me to ask you a strategic national defense question which affects U.S. political economy and presidential election. Do the American people oppose to maintaining Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii? How do Americans would defend America if and when an attack is attempted by superpowers in the Far Eastern Asia Pacific region, in your view?
gradual economic recovery in the U.S., aligned with the forces reduction prompted by the revolution in military affairs, there might be a slight power vacuum in this Asia-Pacific region. And in your thoughts, what kind of possible instrument or tools for the next elected president in the United States can mind the gap or to fill the power vacuum? Thank you.
In fact, they're all kind of defense security questions, and so they relate to each other very well. But I would say, first of all, that the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton in particular, and my very good friend, Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell, have emphasized pivoting and rebalancing and coming back to Asia. But in my view, the United States really had not left Asia. Kurt Campbell's predecessor focused very highly on North Korea, so he spent most of his time on North Korea. And I think Kurt Campbell has tried to have a broader sweep, and particularly, as I mentioned, emphasizing East Asia Summit and new initiatives. But many of these initiatives were actually ones that had already been taken or set out there by the Bush administration. So there was a great deal of continuity. Now, recently, some things have come up that I think are really quite new and interesting. And one of them is what's happened in Burma or Myanmar. And that is a significant change, and I think it's driven by some internal factors in Burma. They really want international acceptance, but the United States is taking advantage of this to develop a new relationship with Burma. It's in early stages. It can be reversed, but that's really significant. And then I think this February 29th agreement with the North Koreans is a significant agreement. We're being very cautious about this because we've had such disappointing experience in negotiating with the North over the years. But Americans are always optimistic, and so we have to continue to try. And the policy of strategic patience had a limitation in that the North was continuing to build up its enriched uranium facilities and so forth. And so you really, even though we might not like to negotiate with them that much, we're almost forced to do so. I think, however, what you see is an awareness that systemically there's no part of the world that is more important to the United States than East Asia. Always East Asia, and including South Asia, had a majority of the world's population. It has the other great power, China, now. It has very capable militaries. It provides more than a third of the world's production of goods and services. It's the fastest growing area of the world. It has by far the largest amount of world's international currency reserves. And so from an American point of view, it's also outside of Canada and Mexico. Our largest trading partners by far are in Asia Pacific. Growth area for our exports. So this is a region which I think is far more important to us than any other part of the world. And it's an area that has suffered in some ways in terms of our visibility because of the very significant problems in the Middle East. The Middle East, of course, is also an important area of the world. It's where the terrorism largely comes from. It's where the energy resources and imports for the whole world largely come from. And so we do have to pay attention to it. But as we reduce the military power that we've had in the Middle East, a good part of that will come home, I'm sure. But there is this potential for rebalancing in Asia Pacific. But it should not be simply a military strategy. It needs to be a broad strategy, including our public diplomacy. And of course, I would argue that institutions like the East-West Center that have played a role in promoting the U.S.-Asia relationship, including the one with China, is a very important part of this rebalancing effort. So I very much welcome what the Obama administration is doing, and I hope it will continue. Now, on the U.S.-China relationship, as I said, this is a very significant relationship. There is a minority of Americans that think that China in some way needs to be contained. But that has never been the policy of any administration. The policy has always been to try to engage China, to try to develop a relationship with China so that China is also working with the United States in providing global goods. And China is a power that is certainly focused in many ways on its own economic development at this stage of its history. But as it continues to develop and to have global interests, it also has to support the global institutions, global rules. There obviously will be differences in the way Chinese see these than Americans see these, but the important thing is that the two countries work together, but not simply in a G2 context. And that's why Korea, Japan, Europe all become very important in the whole G20 process, so that in a sense we socialize the Chinese and have a lot of exchanges so that going forward that we're all working together to try to maintain the global system. The United States is not trying to contain China, it's trying to work with China. And in fact, the United States has been a very important part of China's own economic development process. Now, I think there is a potential for perceptions of a power vacuum, but I don't really see a power vacuum developing. I certainly don't think there's any threat to Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor is a facility that's very etched in the minds of the American public as an essential bastion of our security, and our security particularly in this part of the world. There is no anticipated attacks that we see on Pearl Harbor, and certainly the Japanese were very foolish to try to attack it 70 years ago, and I can't see anyone who would have any capability of doing that today. So this is a base that will continue, but the United States is not in a position where it wants to expand base arrangements. It's in fact readjusting. It is reducing in some ways overseas presence, and the revolution in military affairs that you've referred to allows us to project power in offshore in ways that we couldn't do before without foreign bases. So we're not, as far as I know, trying to increase any foreign bases. In fact, in Okinawa, we're trying to reduce our footprint. Guam also is an important base for projecting U.S. power, but Guam will not be as significant as it may have seemed a few years back. So I think, if you look at the U.S. presence globally, and you look at it by different areas of power, still in the defense area, the U.S. is overwhelmingly the world's power. It's the only country that can project power on a global basis. It has defense spending that's equal to the next 15 countries combined. And if anything, I think what's more important is to focus on the dimensions of U.S. power, economic dimensions, and cultural and education dimensions, which are also very strong and involve less government and more society as a whole, but need more conscious support. In international education, the U.S. has tremendous educational institutions, but I think we have not kind of given the export of educational services the attention that, say, the Australians and the Canadians, the British do, and I feel that's an area which is quite important to our society, but less degrees in the United States and more overseas experiences in the United States as part of degrees that people have in their own country. So I think for many decades in the future, the U.S. remains a society which, by nature of its political system, its economic system, will be very dynamic, very vigorous, partly, I should say, also because of its immigration policy It'll be a very vigorous society. It'll be a hub of world activity, but it won't be the only hub. And so Americans increasingly need to learn about, focus on, be aware of the other hubs of world power.
Hi, Charles. As one of the issues and alumnus, I really would like to welcome you to Korea. I have basically two questions. One is on security matters, the other one economics. First question is related to how the United States perceive North Korea's new leadership, Kim Jong-un. And seems to me the U.S. is ready to open up a new dialogue by offering some food aid to North Korea. In return, U.S. got the North Korea would freeze a contemporary uranium enrichment program. Now, my question is that the U.S. still maintain dismantlement of nuclear facility first, North Korea, and then the diplomatic normalization. On the other hand, North Korea and Seoul plan diplomatic normalization first, and then they will go through the dismantlement of nuclear facilities. So how do you think this, different approach toward the North Korean nuclear issues could be evolved as Kim Jong-un new leadership took power in Korea? And the second question on the Trans-Pacific partnership, as you said, the President Obama belatedly supported CORAS-FTA, and then he pushed new momentum at TPP at the APEC meeting in Honolulu November last year. And now Japan declared to join the TPP in the position, and I think from now on, the whole picture of TPP is a bargaining process between the U.S. and Japan. My question is that what is your time frame in which the TPP could be concluded? I mean, to what extent is so serious? And Professor Bhagwati, he disputed that the TPP is nothing but on the part of the United States to contain China. Because the U.S. proposal contains a lot of non-trade related issues which China simply cannot accept. That simply indicates that this is nothing but the containment policy against China. Thank you very much.
Dr. Morrison, I thank you for your presentation, and actually would like to follow up my question about North Korea. Seems to me that the agenda of the six-party talks is very narrow, and the progress has been in fits and starts. So, what about broadening the agenda to include other conversations and new stakeholders? UN, EU would be some logical partners. The nuclear conversation, I think, is not going to be too productive down the line, and one should anticipate a broader conversation about a permanent resolution to the conflict. Thank you.
Sorry, I'd like to just get back to U.S. politics for a moment. I'm wondering what you think would be the, what do you think is the likely outcome of these elections? You didn't really want to say. And then also, the U.S. government has been almost paralyzed, and it looks like it will continue to be paralyzed until the election. So, which election outcome do you think will be most favorable in terms of remedial policies to help to correct the economic imbalances that we're facing now? The Democrats win, and we're just going to see more of the same. Republicans come in, and we see more likely, remedies coming in. That's my question. Thank you.
I think I'll just take these in reverse order and start with this election question. And I think, as I said, the presidential election, I think, is very hard to predict. But let's just assume that President Obama will win re-election. And I think there's slight more chance of that than his losing. But there's so many intervening variables. But as I said, the Congress is a different matter. And so what we could have is a Republican Congress, both houses, and a Democratic president. And this is not a very good formula for moving beyond the stagnation and problems of partisanship that we have now. And yet there may be, and I think there already has been, a certain kind of disciplining. The public kind of disapproval of institutions make politicians aware that the partisanship can be very damaging to them individually, and so you see that some of the voices that were very loud on the partisan side have kind of dampened down, I think, in the last few months. But I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't know what you can do to develop a coherent kind of middle course that will attract support from both the Congress and the Republican majorities in that Congress and from the president. But I have a feeling that after the election, it's always kind of a honeymoon period. Whoever wins, and there needs to be some kind of initiative, which should normally come from the White House, for a national dialogue and effort to get some kind of a consensus. But anyway, that's a really important question for the American people, and I'm not sure what the answer to it is. On the question of TPP, there are really two kind of forces, I think, behind TPP, and one that you mentioned is a feeling. I think it's not so much trying to contain or shut out China, but the United States was absent from the free trade effort in Asia, and so China and ASEAN were kind of hubs. Korea is a hub of free trade agreements, and the United States was not part of that picture. And if we were going to be a leading economic power, we needed to have free trade agreements, a much more proactive policy toward free trade agreements other than individual bilateral one-on-one agreements. And the only way in the American system to get a free trade agreement, because of the Congress gives the power over foreign commerce to the states, so to the Congress rather, and so the executive branch always has difficulty in maintaining the leadership, except to the extent it's delegated by Congress, and that's why the Trade Promotion Authority, which we used to call Fast Track Authority, becomes so important. And to get that authority and to be able to have negotiations, you have to have a very comprehensive set of negotiations. We call it platinum style free trade agreements, and virtually no other country wants these. Korea bravely has stepped up to the plate, and we have a very comprehensive free trade agreement. But the ASEAN countries, we tried one with Thailand, broke down in the middle of after 2 negotiating sessions. Tried one with Malaysia. They are now a TPP partner, but that also broke down. So the idea of TPP was get a very small group of like-minded countries, and the actual trade value will not be very much, because most of these countries already have free trade agreements with each other. U.S. has free trade agreement with Peru, it has with Chile, it has with Australia, it has with Singapore. Brunei doesn't matter. New Zealand, of course, is connected in partly through Australia, but that is will be an addition. And so the big partner in TPP up to the Japanese question was Vietnam. And Vietnam is there really more for balance. We told the Canadians they can't join it because that would have too many American countries in the Western Hemisphere, and we didn't have enough Asian ones, and so we added Vietnam to bring the Asia one in. They seem very willing, but it creates big negotiating problems for the Americans because Vietnam has state-owned enterprises. It has a very large, low-income workforce, lots of questions about pollution, union workers' rights, and so forth, will all become very complicated in the ratification process of TPP. So, when the Japanese then said we would like to join, in a certain way we welcome that. It looks like the process is expanding. The Chinese, who initially didn't take it very seriously, are now actually studying it and looking at it. But on the other hand, Japan would introduce again another group of negotiating questions on what is already going to be a very difficult negotiation. So my professional friends in USTR are much less enthusiastic than some of the higher level policy types about negotiating with the Japanese, because they're the ones who actually have to do it. But the real force in the intellectual force behind TPP is to set out a kind of model 21st century free trade agreement. And we've done that a little bit in the APEC process through model measures. What should be the model measures in each of these kinds of free trade agreements? But in fact, nobody pays any attention to model measures. So why don't we set up a model free trade agreement among the freest trading countries that we can, see if we could get that through it. And I don't know that we will. It may never be negotiated. It may be negotiated but never passed, ratified in the various parliamentary bodies that it needs to be. But it's worth the effort. It's worth the effort because it's educational, because it gives us something to work for, and because in the end it's not to oppose economies like China, but it's to bring them in and to provide a model out there, a benchmark in which all of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region will join. It's considered to be a step forward toward a free trade agreement of Asia-Pacific. Now, the question about North Korea. I think the American attention to North Korea is much, of course, lower than that of South Korea. And so when the leadership transition took place, the analyses that you saw in the press tended to be quite superficial. They emphasized the bad things that had happened in North Korea under the previous leader. They emphasized the lack of experience of the new leader, questions about whether he could actually govern the country. Would there be a period of instability? But the important thing is, I think, that the governmental people who are really engaged in the process had already started a negotiation looking toward an agreement that would cover humanitarian aid, and that's incidentally separate from the agreement that would cover what North Korea would do on the nuclear side. And they were worried that that would be disrupted, delayed by the change in the leadership, and it has not been. And so that's an encouraging sign, I think, that discussions can go forward with the North Koreans, that they themselves have perhaps changed direction. They had a very bad year in 2009 when they greeted the new Bush administration with an atomic blast and missile tests, and in 2010 when we had these two tragic incidents happening here in South Korea. But hopefully, partly thanks to some pressures from the Chinese and partly through the sanctions process, that we have a different outcome, a different view in North Korea. Nonetheless, nobody is very sanguine about this. With North Korea, it's always we want to be shown that there'll really be significant changes, and to date, lots of promises, but not nearly the follow-through that we wanted. Now, what is the objective? Is it denuclearization? That is definitely the formal objective, but there's a lot of skepticism in the United States that North Korea, once having had gotten a nuclear capability, using that effectively from their point of view for bargaining, for support, will want to completely give it up. Still, that will be our objective, and I think it's very hard to see a true normalization process without that objective being achieved. But there can be a process by which steps are taken. And so it's, as I said in the previous administration, action for action and so forth. We can move toward, interest sections, so representatives in the different countries. There have already been, aside from these negotiations, a very important second track meeting over this past weekend. So we are back in a direction, I think, that is making some steps that hopefully will be encouraged. I want to say that, though, on food aid, that one should not think that this is a quid pro quo for the North Korean steps on the bringing back the inspectors and stopping the enriched uranium program. Humanitarian assistance, which is we call nutritional aid, is very much dependent upon some ability by the international community to monitor where that food aid goes to and to be sure that it's going to people, particularly women and children that are in conditions of starvation. The United States, since 1995, has been one of the most generous countries, along with South Korea and China, in terms of food aid to the North Korea. And I think that's because of just genuine humanitarian interest in the situation of the people there. No matter what the government situation is, we need to help the people. Now, broadening the six-party talks, whether the six-party talks take place again, I think they're probably likely to take place, but there's still a number of steps that need to be taken, and including on the North Korean side. But if you're trying to address a specific problem, and the specific problem is the nuclear weapons capability of the North, you really need a process that deals with that problem. And if we start to broaden that out to too many things, Dr. Hsu, I'm afraid that it will lose its edge in dealing with that significant problem. But the other issues in North Korea's relationship with the rest of the world are very important in their own right, and these include the human rights problems, they include the humanitarian problems, they include environmental problems, they include trying to end the war, trying to reduce incidents, whether they're incidents at sea or incidents along the borders. And those don't need to be swept up into one particular negotiating process. The UN and the EU and other powers will have relevance to some of those issues, but there are other issues that are much more really north-south issues than they are even issues that involve the United States or involve China or Japan. So some forums will be small forums, some will be larger forums, but I think there'll have to be multiple forums for dealing with North Korea. One of my own hobby horses is that I think we do need a kind of a North Pacific entity. Partly because, APEC and East Asia Summit have so many Southeast Asian countries, but the crux of power in this region and actually in the world now lies in Northeast Asia. Japan, China, US are the largest single national economies in the world, and Korea is one of the most energetic economies in the world. So I think if you can get Russia, Japan, China, U.S., South Korea together on the issues that are not just regional issues, but also provide global leadership, and I'm not necessarily meaning at the summit level, but at at ministerial levels and so forth. I think that this is a region that really is the core area of the globe right now, and we need some process by which we consult on these big global issues as well as the regional issues and provide global leadership. And that's what Ilse Kong did so well with the G20 process. That is a process that goes, of course, beyond the Asia-Pacific region, but Asia-Pacific is its core. And it was so refreshing, I think, to see the leadership that was provided during the Korean year of leading G20. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. You covered a very wide range of issues, from U.S. politics to North Korean nuclear issues. I suppose we can go on like this all day, but we have to end this session here. And actually, Dr. Morrison is scheduled to leave this afternoon to the Honolulu. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and wisdom with us on various issues. And we're looking forward to having you more frequently. Thank you.